Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. The Disappearing Banker. London, 2011. The global financial crisis is still shaking economies. Investment banks are under scrutiny. Protests erupt in the streets, but behind the polished glass of Sterling Row Capital, a storm brews silently. Act 1, The Executive. Julian Marks was a well-dressed, sharp-witted senior executive at Sterling Row Capital, a boutique firm handling billions in offshore accounts and corporate assets. Known for his charm and discretion, Julian managed some of the firm's highest-profile clients. Despite his confidence, whispers circulated internally. Junior analysts noticed discrepancies, duplicate wire transfers, paper trails ending in tax havens, and client accounts vanishing overnight. 3 weeks before his disappearance, the UK Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, launched a quiet inquiry into Sterling Row's international dealings. No charges yet, just preliminary interviews and data requests. Julian didn't seem fazed. Act 2, The Vanishing. April 14, 2011. Julian was last seen leaving the office at 6:47 p.m., captured by the building's security cameras. He told colleagues he was heading to the countryside for a quiet weekend. But Julian never arrived at his cottage in Sussex. He never used his credit cards again. His phone last pinged near Waterloo Station, then went silent. When Monday came, he didn't show up at work. By Tuesday, panic spread among the partners. On Wednesday, the firm was raided by investigators. Julian was gone. Act 3, The Investigation. Detectives found Julian's apartment in pristine condition. No signs of foul play but odd clues. His passport was missing, but his car was still parked in his usual spot. His suitcase was packed, but contained mostly outdated clothes and no electronics. A train ticket to Paris was never used, but he'd purchased it in cash the day before vanishing. His bank accounts? Frozen. His digital footprint? Wiped clean. No social media, no new credit activity, no sightings. But in his locked office drawer, investigators discovered a USB drive labeled Touring. It contained spreadsheets tracing over £120 million to shell companies, all filtered through a web of jurisdictions. It was the roadmap the FCA needed. But still, no Julian. Act 4, Theories. The media exploded with theories. Escape plot: Julian caught wind of the investigation and fled using a false identity. Whistleblower deal: some believed he was working with authorities and was placed in protective custody. Internal betrayal: others claimed his disappearance was orchestrated not by enemies, but by partners protecting secrets. A freelance journalist, Clara Venn, traced one of the shell companies to an abandoned office in Panama City rented by a man under Julian's middle name. She found a photo of a man boarding a boat. From behind, the resemblance was uncanny. Act 5, The End. Or a Beginning. 10 years later, Julian Marks remains officially missing. Sterling Row Capital paid a massive settlement. No one went to jail. And the Touring USB? It disappeared from the FCA's case archive, an internal oversight, they said. But every April 14th, an anonymous email is sent to a retired investigator from Julian's case. It contains no message. Just GPS coordinates. Each one leads to a financial district: Singapore, Zurich, Dubai. Always near a bank. Story 2. Secrets of the Silent Town. Bridgeland, a picturesque rural town nestled near the edge of thick woodland in northern Vermont, population 2,104. Framed by misty hills and forgotten roads, it looks like the kind of place you'd stop at for gas on a road trip and maybe never leave. Act 1, The Pattern. Over the past 9 years, Bridgeland has quietly reported 14 missing persons, all within a 5-mile radius surrounding the town's north side. Tourists, hikers, a substitute teacher, even a traveling insurance agent. Each case was recorded, some investigated. But none were ever solved. Locals didn't like talking about it. When pressed, they'd mumble something about the hollow, a wooded ravine where fog never seemed to lift, even in summer. More chillingly, many of the disappearances were preceded by odd events. Flickering streetlights across town with no electrical faults found. A strange high-pitched humming heard late at night. Identical dreams reported by different townsfolk of walking alone through fog and never turning back. Act 2, The Investigator. Eli Monroe, a freelance podcast host and amateur investigator, grew up in Bridgeland before leaving for Boston. He returns after the mysterious disappearance of his childhood friend, Rachel, the latest in the list. Rachel had last texted Eli a photo of an old stone marker in the woods, etched with strange initials, S.O.T. Locals claimed it had always been there. Nobody knew who carved it. Nobody ever dared go near it after dark. Eli sets up a makeshift investigation studio in his late grandmother's home, starts recording interviews, and digging through town archives. He discovers a 19th-century logging community once stood near the hollow. It was abruptly abandoned after a mine collapse, though no mine entrances are documented. A land deed buried in the town hall files, listing a sanctum of threes owning the surrounding property in 1883. Local legends mention a third bell that rings in the church tower some nights, even though only 2 bells were ever installed. Act 3, The Town Secret. Eli's podcast, Silent Signals, gains traction. Listeners from all over send in stories. One woman emails saying her missing brother once visited Bridgeland in 2017. Another recalls waking up in her car outside the town with 3 hours unaccounted for. With help from an old friend in local utilities, Eli discovers missing records of power outages in a tight cluster near the edge of town. GPS data from Rachel's phone shows she was last stationary at 3:03 a.m., precisely where the fog rolls in and signal cuts out. In a final interview with the retired librarian, Mrs. Harrow, she quietly says, "The town made a choice, long ago. Some things were buried. Not everything wants to stay buried." Act 4, Into the Hollow. Eli ventures into the fog near the stone marker recorder on, flashlight flickering. There, he hears 3 chimes, deep and haunting. He finds remnants of old shoes, broken glasses, a compass all rusted but strangely placed in a circle. Suddenly, the air becomes impossibly still. Birds fall silent. The fog shifts, and a door-shaped frame of moss-covered stone appears. Just before his recording cuts off, Eli whispers, "There's something here. It's not a place, it's a decision." Act 5, The Aftermath. Eli never posts again. But 1 week later, a pre-scheduled podcast episode is uploaded. It's just ambient forest sounds, followed by 3 slow chimes. A local reporter finds his cabin abandoned, lights on, coffee still warm. In Bridgeland, life goes on. Quietly. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in just right, you can hear a faint humming and a bell that doesn't belong. Story 3. The Great Museum Heist. The Ashcroft National Gallery, a sprawling neoclassical museum in London known for housing some of Europe's most valuable Renaissance and Impressionist paintings. Security is tight. Cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced vaults protect its priceless collections. But on March 16, 1987, the impossible happened. Act 1, The Theft. It was the morning after a black tie gala hosted at the gallery for an art conservation charity. Staff arrived to find the East Wing's security doors wide open, no sign of forced entry. Gone were 7 paintings, including a Monet, a Vermeer, and a mysterious unsigned Baroque piece rumored to have a coded signature. The estimated value, £74 million, now worth over £200 million. Strangely, no alarms were triggered. Security footage was blank from 2:01 to 2:18 a.m. Guard rotations were on time, but no one saw a thing. A single feather was found on the marble floor beneath where the glass violinist once hung. There was no note, no known suspects, and no ransom demand. Act 2, Theories and Suspicions. Investigators, insurance agencies, and international law enforcement combed through every angle. Theories emerged. Inside job. Nothing stolen from any wing except the east, which had been unlocked for the gala. Tech sabotage? The security firm swore their system couldn't be bypassed, yet the blackout was too precise to be an accident. Diversion. Some believed the gala was planned for the heist, its guest list including diplomats, celebrities, and a reclusive collector. Art for arms exchange? Whispers emerged suggesting the paintings were traded in the black market for weaponry or political favors. But nothing stuck. The paintings had vanished and so had the trail. Act 3, Decades later. In 2022, a curious event reignited interest in the case. A photo surfaced online showing a young violinist practicing in a Paris loft. Behind her, blurry but unmistakable, the glass violinist, thought lost forever. Interpol traced the image, but the loft was empty when they arrived. The woman in the photo was never identified. Separately, a rare canvas stamp from one of the missing paintings was found inside a vintage bookstore in Vienna, tucked into a book on optical illusions. These breadcrumbs pointed to a deeper puzzle. Act 4, The Ghost Crew. Rumors circulated in art circles about a group called the Pale Assembly, a collective of former artists, forgers, and conservators who believed certain masterpieces were too important to be locked away. Their goal wasn't to sell or destroy, but to liberate, to rescue art from private vaults and place them in secret public locations known only to those who understand the clues. A coded postcard appeared on the 35th anniversary of the heist. It read, "The art sleeps where no alarms ring. Beneath the gaze of clocks that don't tick. Seek the gallery that charges nothing. In a city whose name ends in silence." Cryptographers suggested it referred to a forgotten underground art station in Ghent, Belgium. Act 5, Still unsolved. To this day, none of the stolen pieces have been officially recovered. The museum maintains replicas in the empty frames, a reminder of one of the most perfect crimes in modern history. The Ashcroft Gallery now displays a permanent exhibit titled The Vanished Seven. It features digital renderings of the paintings, the feather found on the floor, a map of possible escape routes, copies of anonymous letters speculated to be from the thieves. Visitors walk through the exhibit in near silence, under a giant clock that ticks but shows no hands. Story 4. The Cipher Journal. Introduction. In the quiet town of Elder Glen, nestled between misty hills and ancient oaks, a forgotten box of old books donated to the local library sparked a mystery that would ripple through time. The story begins not with a scream or a siren, but with a whisper from the past bound in leather and sealed in code. Chapter 1, The Discovery. Margaret Elwood, a retired librarian known for her love of puzzles and rare books, volunteered part-time at the Elder Glen Historical Library. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through a donation box left anonymously on the steps, she came across an old journal with no title, just a brass clasp and yellowed pages. Inside were neatly written lines but in no recognizable language. The symbols resembled a cross between shorthand and cipher code. Intrigued, Margaret brought the journal home. Chapter 2, Breaking the Code. Using her background in linguistics and help from an online community of amateur cryptographers, Margaret worked tirelessly for weeks. She finally cracked the first few pages. The journal was from 1952, written by someone identifying themselves only as E.W. The entries detailed a series of strange encounters, surveillance, and references to an incident at Hollow Creek, a location outside town now long forgotten. Chapter 3, The Incident. As Margaret decoded more, a chilling narrative emerged. E.W. was part of a covert Cold War-era operation involving illegal government testing on civilians. One particular entry described an accidental death. The author claimed someone named Anna R. was killed during one of these unapproved field trials. The next entries showed the author panicking. They mentioned covering up the incident and burying evidence near a farmhouse where the willow leans west. Chapter 4, The Search. Margaret cross-referenced property records and found a decaying farmhouse that once stood near Hollow Creek. She contacted local authorities, and after much persistence, a small dig was allowed under supervision. What they found stunned them all: fragments of old medical equipment, rusted military dog tags, and partially preserved documents sealed in waxed oilcloth. Among them, a faded photo of a young woman labeled Anna R. Chapter 5, The Investigation. The discovery reopened a long-closed missing person case from 1953. Records showed Anna Reynolds, a young nurse, vanished without a trace after joining a new health initiative linked to a rural testing program. At the time, her disappearance was ruled a runaway case. Now, with physical evidence and the journal, officials began piecing together what could have been an experimental drug trial gone horribly wrong, one that was never sanctioned. Chapter 6, Silence and Shadows. Despite media attention, no living officials from the 1950s program could be located. Records were classified or destroyed. Some believe the truth was buried intentionally. Margaret's finds sparked debate in historical and legal circles, but without clear documentation or confessions, no charges could be filed. The journal, now housed in Elder Glen's Historical Museum, remains a cryptic relic, its final pages still partially undecoded. Conclusion. The Cipher Journal reveals how a forgotten relic and a curious mind can resurface the secrets history tried to erase. In Elder Glen, the past never really rests. And in the silence of old books, the truth still waits to be read. Story 5. The Identity Swapper. Introduction. When police arrested a man for shoplifting a watch from a downtown store in Manchester, UK, they expected a routine case of petty theft. But what began as a simple arrest unraveled into a complex international mystery. The man had no valid ID but multiple names, mismatched fingerprints, and a face recognized in 3 countries. Who was he really? And what exactly was he hiding? Chapter 1, The Arrest. On a rainy Thursday afternoon in 2019, Manchester police responded to a routine shoplifting call. A man in his early 40s had been caught on CCTV slipping a high-end watch into his jacket at a department store. He gave the name David Carter and claimed to have no fixed address. When brought in, his behavior was polite but evasive. He had no wallet, no phone, and oddly, no clear accent. The name David Carter brought up no recent records. Chapter 2, Anomalies in the System. Standard fingerprint processing returned an unexpected result: not 1, but 3 matches in different countries, none under the name David Carter. One was from a 2012 burglary arrest in Barcelona under the name Joaquim Vidal. Another was from a minor fraud case in Canada in 2016 as Lucas Grant. A third was flagged from a suspicious border crossing in Romania under the name Alexei Popov. Each identity came with a different nationality, different birthday, and different backstory. Facial recognition couldn't conclusively confirm any of them. Chapter 3, International Interest. Interpol flagged the case. The suspect had no passport, no visa records, and no clear residence. Yet, each of his aliases had documentation, all of which had been used at different times and locations across the last 15 years. Authorities began to wonder, was he a spy? A scam artist? Or someone running from something far more dangerous? Chapter 4, The Canadian Lead. Investigators focused on the Lucas Grant identity. In 2016, he had been questioned in Toronto in connection with a financial fraud ring never charged. Records showed he rented an apartment using a fake social insurance number. Strangely, neighbors remembered him as quiet, always wearing gloves, and never staying in one place for long. One neighbor described him as a man who spoke every language like it was his second. Chapter 5, The Spanish Trail. In Spain, Joaquim Vidal had a police file for breaking into a closed hostel in Barcelona. When arrested, he spoke fluent Catalan but claimed to be from Argentina. He was released due to lack of evidence and disappeared days later. Spanish authorities recalled a backpack he left behind with an encrypted USB drive and photos of various passports, all bearing different names but his face. Chapter 6, A Shadow Without Roots. Despite months of investigation, no birth certificate, family connection, or digital trail could conclusively tie this man to any one place. He had no social media, no permanent address, and no known associates. Forensic analysis suggested he had altered his fingerprints partially and even had minor cosmetic surgery, likely to obscure facial ID systems. A psychological evaluation suggested above-average intelligence, photographic memory, and fluency in at least 6 languages. But the man, when pressed, simply smiled and said, "Who I was doesn't matter. Who I am, is up to you." Chapter 7, Legal Limbo. Without a confirmed identity or country of origin, extradition became impossible. No country claimed him, and he claimed none in return. He was eventually charged only with theft and minor fraud in the UK, the only verifiable crime. After serving 14 months, he was quietly released. He vanished 3 days later. Conclusion. To this day, the identity swapper remains one of the most perplexing modern mysteries in law enforcement. Was he a rogue agent, an elite scam artist, or someone fleeing a hidden past? No fingerprints, name, or face since has matched his. One thing is certain, whoever he was, he didn't want to be found, and he was very, very good at it. Story SX. The Forgotten Phone Booth. Introduction. In the sleepy rural town of Elmridge, population 802, there stands a rusted, graffiti-covered phone booth on the outskirts of town. It hasn't been connected to any phone line in over 20 years or so, the phone company claims. Yet every Thursday, at precisely 3:33 a.m., the phone rings. And those brave or curious enough to answer report hearing the same thing, a woman's voice asking softly, "Have you found my name yet?" Chapter 1, A Town That Time Forgot. Elmridge sits on the edge of the state forest, nestled between 2 forgotten highways. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. The phone booth located just past mile marker 7 was once used by travelers before cell phones became commonplace. But after a lightning strike in 1999, it was declared out of service. The company removed the wiring, sealed the connection, and left the booth as is. Yet in 2006, a teenager named Lexi Boone claimed she heard the phone ring while walking home from a party. Curious, she answered and heard a woman whisper, "Have you found my name yet?" She laughed it off until the next week. And the next. The phone rang again. Always at 3:33 a.m. Chapter 2, The Pattern Emerges. Over the years, other locals including hunters, night shift workers, and high school dares began to report the same call. Same time. Same voice. Same question. But there was more. Some said the voice changed slightly, as though it was becoming impatient. Others claimed they felt cold while holding the receiver, or that the town's streetlights flickered right after the call ended. In 2012, amateur investigator and podcaster Drew Fenley visited Elmridge to document the phenomenon. He recorded audio of the phone ringing, though the voice never came through during his visit. Strangely, his equipment malfunctioned, and his recordings were corrupted when he tried to transfer them. Still, Drew's podcast Signal Lost brought national attention to the forgotten booth. Chapter 3, The Woman in the Archives. In 2014, a librarian named Hazel Crocker uncovered something curious while digitizing old newspaper archives. An unsolved missing persons report from 1977 involved a young woman named Eleanor Vane, last seen near the very same stretch of road where the booth now stands. Eleanor had moved to Elm Ridge temporarily to care for her ailing aunt. She vanished one evening after making a call from the payphone. Her case was cold within a year. No leads. No body. No trace. After Hazel posted about the story on a community forum, a strange thing happened. The phone rang again, but this time, not just in Elm Ridge. 2 towns over, in a booth outside a gas station long since abandoned, a night worker claimed to hear the exact same voice, same question. Have you found my name yet? Chapter 4, The Journal. In 2018, construction near the original booth unearthed a buried tin box. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, moldy but mostly intact. The entries appeared to be written by someone watching people come and go from the phone booth over time. Phrases like, "The girl in red answered. She is not ready. He knows her name but not the reason. Thursday is safest. The hour of truth is always 3:33. The last entry was dated 1982, 5 years after Eleanor disappeared. No one could determine who wrote it, or how it ended up buried near the booth. Chapter 5, The Experiment. In 2021, a documentary team returned to Elm Ridge to test the phone under controlled conditions. They installed hidden cameras, audio monitors, even thermal imaging. The booth rang exactly on schedule. But the footage revealed no source. No power lines. No wireless triggers. And the voice, when captured on their recording equipment, was garbled. Almost as if it was speaking backwards, or from underwater. The words were still clear to the person answering. Have you found my name yet? The team disbanded weeks later. The footage was never released. Chapter 6, A Haunting or a Code. Today, the booth remains. Locals avoid it. Visitors leave trinkets or flowers by the side. Some believe Eleanor Vane is trying to reach out not for help, but for closure. Others suspect the phone is part of something older, an unsolved crime, a town secret, a signal from a time loop tragedy still playing out every Thursday before dawn. Still, the question remains unanswered. Have you found my name yet? Conclusion. The forgotten phone booth isn't just a local mystery anymore. It's a digital age legend born from analog relics. And whether the truth lies in crime, coincidence, or something supernatural, the line is still open. So if you ever find yourself on that rural road at 3:33 a.m. and the phone starts to ring, you have 2 choices. Walk away. Or answer it. Just be ready for the question. Story 7. A finder of missing heirs. The professional prosecutor is continually surprised at the insignificant amount of crime existing in comparison with the extraordinary scope of criminal opportunity. To be sure, the number of crimes actually detected is infinitesimal, as contrasted with those committed, but even so the conviction constantly grows. That the world is astonishingly honest when one considers the unlikelihood that any specific prospective offense will be discovered. How few dishonest servants there are, for example, out of the million or so composing that class of persons, who have an unlimited opportunity to snap up not only unconsidered trifles, but personal property of great value. The actual honesty of the servants is probably greater than that of the masters in the final analysis. Men are not only presumed to be innocent in the eyes of the law, but are found to be so, as a matter of daily experience, so far as honesty in the ordinary affairs of life is concerned, and the fact that we rely so implicitly upon the truthfulness and integrity of our fellows is the principal reason why violations of this imperative social law should be severely dealt with. If it were possible adequately to determine or deal with any such issue, mere lying should be made a crime. It is matter of constant wonder that shrewd businessmen will put through all sorts of deals, when thousands of dollars are at stake, relying entirely upon the word of some single person, whom they do not in fact know. John Smith is looking for a house. He finds one he likes with an old lady, who says her name is Sarah Jones, living in it, and offers her $40,000 for her real estate. She accepts. His lawyer searches the title and finds that Sarah Jones is the owner of record. The old lady is invited to the lawyer's office, executes a warranty deed, and goes off with the $40,000. Now, in a great number of instances, no one really knows whether the aged dame is Sarah Jones or not, and she perhaps may be, and sometimes is, only the caretaker's second cousin, who is looking after the house in the latter's absence. There are thousands of acres of land and hundreds of millions of money waiting at compound interest to be claimed by unknown heirs or next of kin. Even if the real ones cannot be found, one would think that this defect could be easily supplied by some properly ingenious person. My Uncle Bill went to sea in '45 and was never heard from again. Will you find out if he left any money? Wrote a client to the author. Careful search failed to reveal any money. But if the money had been found first, how easy it would have been to turn up a nephew. Yet the industry of producing properly authenticated nephews, heirs, legatees, next of kin and claimants of all sorts has never been adequately developed. There are plenty of agents who for a moderate fee will inform you whether or not there is a fortune waiting for you, but there is no agency within the writer's knowledge which will supply an heir for every fortune. From a business point of view, the idea seems to have possibilities. Some few years after the Civil War, a Swede named Evy Peterson emigrated to this country to better his condition. Fortune smiled upon him and he amassed a modest bank account, which, with considerable foresight, he invested in a large tract of unimproved land in the region known as the Bronx, New York City. In the summer of 1888, Peterson determined to take a vacation and revisit Sweden, and accordingly deeded all his real estate to his wife. Just before starting, he decided to take his wife and only child, a little girl of 10 or 12, with him. Accordingly they set sail from Hoboken Saturday, August 11th, upon the steamer Gazer, of the Thingvalla line, bound for Copenhagen. At 4 o'clock Tuesday morning, at a point 30 miles south of Sable Island and 200 miles out of Halifax, the Gazer, in the midst of a thick fog, crashed suddenly into a sister ship, the Thingvalla, of the same line, and sank. The Thingvalla was herself badly crippled, but, after picking up 31 survivors, managed to limp into Halifax, from which port the rescued were brought to New York. Only 14 of the Gazer's passengers had been saved, and the Petersons were not among them. They were never heard of again, and no relatives came forward to claim their property, which, happening to be in the direct line of the city's development, was in course of time mapped out into streets and house lots and became exceedingly valuable. Gradually houses were built upon it, various people bought it for investment, and it took on the look of other semi-developed suburban property. In the month of December, 1905, over 17 years after the sinking of the Gazer, a lawyer named H. Huffman Brown offered to sell at a bargain to a young architect named Benjamin Leviton 2 house lots adjacent to the southwest corner of 174th Street and Monroe Avenue, New York City. It so happened that Brown had, not long before, induced Leviton to go into another real estate deal, in which the architect's suspicions had been aroused by finding that the property alleged by the lawyer to be improved was, in fact, unbuilt upon. He had lost no money in the original transaction, but he determined that no such mistake should occur a second time. And he accordingly visited the property, and also had a search made of the title, which revealed the fact that Brown was not the record owner, as he had stated, but that, on the contrary, the land stood in the name of William R. Hubert. It should be borne in mind that both the parties to this proposed transaction were men well known in their own professions. Brown, particularly, was a real estate lawyer of some distinction, and an editor of what were known as the Old New York Civil Procedure Reports. He was a middle-aged man, careful in his dress, particular in his speech, modest and quiet in his demeanor, by reputation a gentleman and a scholar, and had practiced at the New York bar some 25 years. But Leviton, who had seen many wolves in sheep's clothing, and had something of the Sherlock Holmes in his composition, determined to seek the advice of the district attorney, and having done so, received instructions to go ahead and consummate the purchase of the property. He, therefore, informed Brown that he had learned that the latter was not the owner of record, to which Brown replied that that was true, but that the property really did belong to him in fact, being recorded in Hubert's name merely as a matter of convenience, because Hubert was unmarried, and that, moreover, he, Brown, had an unrecorded deed from Hubert to himself, which he would produce, or would introduce Hubert to Leviton and let him execute a deed direct. Leviton assented to the latter proposition, and the 14th of December, 1905, was fixed as the date for the delivery of the deeds and the payment for the property. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of that day Brown appeared at Leviton's office, where a detective was already in attendance, and stated that he had been unable to procure Mr. Hubert's personal presence, but had received from him deeds, duly executed, to the property. These he offered to Leviton. At this moment the detective stepped forward, took possession of the papers, and invited the lawyer to accompany him to the district attorney's office. To this Brown offered no opposition, and the party adjourned to the criminal courts building, where Mr. John W. Hart, an assistant district attorney, accused him of having obtained money from Leviton by means of false pretenses as to the ownership of the property, and requested from him an explanation. Brown replied without hesitation that he could not understand why this charge should be made against him, that he had, in fact, received the deeds from Mr. Hubert only a short time before he had delivered them to Leviton, that Mr. Hubert was in New York, that he was the owner of the property, and that no fraud of any sort had been attempted or intended. Mr. Hart now examined the supposed deeds and found that the signatures to them, as well as the signatures to a certain affidavit of title, which set forth that William R. Hubert was a person of substance, had all been executed before a notary, Ella F. Bramman, on that very day. He therefore sent at once for Mrs. Bramman who, upon her arrival, immediately and without hesitation, positively identified the defendant, H. Huffman Brown, as the person who had executed the papers before her an hour or so before. The case on its face seemed clear enough. Brown had apparently deliberately forged William R. Hubert's name, and it did not even seem necessary that Mr. Hubert should be summoned as a witness, since the property was recorded in his name, and Brown himself had stated that Hubert was then actually in New York. But Brown indignantly protested his innocence. It was clear, he insisted, that Mrs. Bramman was mistaken, for why, in the name of common sense, should he, a lawyer of standing, desire to forge Hubert's name, particularly when he himself held an unrecorded deed of the same property, and could have executed a good conveyance to Leviton had the latter so desired. Such a performance would have been utterly without an object. But the lawyer was nervous, and his description of Hubert as a wealthy mine owner from the West, who owned a great deal of property in New York, and had an office in the Flatiron Building, did not ring convincingly in Mr. Hart's ears. The assistant district attorney called up the janitor of the building in question on the telephone. But no such person had an office there. Brown, much flustered, said the janitor was either a fool or a liar. He had been at Hubert's office that very morning. He offered to go and find him in 20 minutes. But Mr. Hart thought that the lawyer had better make his explanation before a magistrate, and caused his arrest and commitment on a charge of forgery. Little did he suspect what an ingenious fraud was about to be unearthed. The days went by and Brown stayed in the Tombs, unable to raise the heavy bail demanded, but no Hubert appeared. Meantime the writer, to whom the case had been sent for trial, ordered a complete search of the title to the property, and in a week or so became possessed, to his amazement, of a most extraordinary and complicated collection of facts. He discovered that the lot of land offered by Brown to Leviton, and standing in Hubert's name, was originally part of the property owned by Ebbe Peterson, the unfortunate Swede who, with his family, had perished in the geyser off Cape Sable in 1888. The title search showed that practically all of the Peterson property had been conveyed by Mary A. Peterson to a person named Ignatius F. X. O'Rourke, by a deed, which purported to have been executed on June 27, 1888, about 2 weeks before the Petersons sailed for Copenhagen, and which was signed with M.R.S. Peterson's mark, but that this deed had not been recorded until July 3, 1899. 11 years after the loss of the geyser. The writer busied himself with finding someone who had known Mrs. Peterson, and by an odd coincidence discovered a woman living in the Bronx who had been an intimate friend and playmate of the little Peterson girl. This witness, who was but a child when the incident had occurred, clearly recalled the fact that Ebbe Peterson had not decided to take his wife and daughter with him on the voyage until a few days before they sailed. They had then invited her, the witness now a Mrs. Cantwell, to go with them, but her mother had declined to allow her to do so. Mrs. Peterson, moreover, according to Mrs. Cantwell, was a woman of education, who wrote a particularly fine hand. Other papers were discovered executed at about the same time, signed by Mrs. Peterson with her full name. It seemed inconceivable that she should have signed any deed, much less one of so much importance, with her mark, and, moreover, that she should have executed any such deed at all when her husband was on the spot to convey his own property. But the strangest fact of all was that the attesting witness to this extraordinary instrument was H. Huffman Brown. It also appeared to have been recorded at his instance 11 years after its execution. In the meantime, however, that is to say, between the sinking of the geyser in 88 and the recording of Mary Peterson's supposed deed in 99, another equally mysterious deed to the same property had been filed. This document, executed and recorded in 1896, purported to convey part of the Peterson property to a man named John J. Keeley, and was signed by a person calling himself Charles A. Clark. By a later deed, executed and signed a few days later, John J. Keeley appeared to have conveyed the same property to Ignatius F. X. O'Rourke, the very person to whom Mrs. Peterson had apparently executed her deed in 1888. and H. Huffman Brown was the attesting witness to both these deeds. A glance at the following diagram will serve to clear up any confusion which may exist in the mind of the reader. 1888 Mary A. Peterson, 1896 Charles A. Clark. Not by her, X, deed conveys same property recorded conveys. 2. Until 1899, IFX. O'Rourke John J. Kiley. 1896 John J. Kiley. Conveys to IFX. O'Rourke. Underscore 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 on. O'Rourke thus holds land through two sources. Brown was the witness to both these parallel transactions. Of course it was simple enough to see what had occurred. In 1896 a mysterious man, named Clark, without vestige of right or title, so far as the records showed, had conveyed Ebby Peterson's property to a man named Keeley, equally unsubstantial, who had passed it over to one O'Rourke. Then Brown had suddenly recorded Mrs. Peterson's deed giving O'Rourke the very same property. Thus this O'Rourke, whoever he may have been, held all the Peterson property by two chains of title, one through Clark and Keeley, and the other through Mrs. Peterson. Then he had gone ahead and deeded it all away to various persons, through one of whom William R. Hubert had secured his title. But every deed on record which purported to pass any fraction of the Peterson property was witnessed by H. Huffman Brown. And Brown was the attesting witness to the deed under which Hubert purported to hold. Thus the chain of title, at the end of which Leviton found himself, ran back to Mary Peterson, with H. Huffman Brown peering behind the heiress of every signature. Mary Peterson Clark Brown. To attesting witness. O'Rourke Kiley. Kiley Brown. To attesting witness. O'Rourke. Underscore 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 underscore. O'Rourke Brown. To attesting witness. William P. Colleton. William P. Colleton. To Brown. John Garretson attesting witness. John Garretson. To Brown. Herman Bolt attesting witness. Herman Bolt. To Brown. Benj. Freeman attesting witness. Benj. Freeman. To Brown. William R. Hubert attesting witness. The assistant district attorney rubbed his forehead and wondered who in thunder all these people were. Who, for example, to begin at the beginning, was Charles A. Clark, and why should he be deeding away Ebby Peterson's property? And who were Keeley and O'Rourke, and all the rest Colleton, Garretson, Bolt, and Freeman? And who, for that matter, was Hubert? A score of detectives were sent out to hunt up these elusive persons, but although the directories of 20 years were searched, no Charles A. Clark, John J. Keeley or IFX O'Rourke could be discovered. Nor could anyone named Colleton, Freeman, or Hubert be found. The only persons who did appear to exist were Garretson and Bolt. Quite by chance the assistant district attorney located the former of these, who proved to be one of Brown's clients, and who stated that he had taken title to the property at the lawyer's request and as a favor to him, did not remember from whom he had received it, had paid nothing for it, received nothing for it, and had finally deeded it to Herman Bolt at the direction of Brown. Herman Bolt, an ex-judge of the municipal court, who had been removed for misconduct in office, admitted grumblingly that, while at one time he had considered purchasing the property in question, he had never actually done so, that the deed from Gerritsen to himself had been recorded without his knowledge or his authority, that he had paid nothing for the property and had received nothing for it, and had, at the instruction of Brown, conveyed it to Benjamin Freeman. Gerritsen apparently had never seen Bolt, and Bolt had never seen Freeman. While William R. Hubert, the person to whom the record showed Freeman had transferred the property, remained an invisible figure, impossible to reduce to tangibility. Just what Brown had attempted to do had done was obvious. In some way. Being a real estate lawyer, he had stumbled upon the fact that this valuable tract of land lay unclaimed. Accordingly, he had set about the easiest way to reduce it to possession. To make assurance doubly sure, he had forged 2 chains of title. One through an assumed heir and the other through the owner herself. Then he had juggled the title through a dozen or so grantees, and stood ready to dispose of the property to the highest bidder. There he stayed in the Tombs, demanding a trial and protesting his innocence, and asserting that if the district attorney would only look long enough he would find William R. Hubert. But an interesting question of law had cropped up to delay matters. Of course, if there was anybody by the name of Hubert who actually owned the property, and Brown had signed his name, conveying the same, to a deed to Leviton, Brown was guilty of forgery in the first degree. But the evidence in the case pointed toward the conclusion that Brown himself was Hubert. If this was so, how could Brown be said to have forged the name of Hubert, when he had a perfect legal right to take the property under any name he chose to assume? This was incontestable. If your name be Richard Roe, you may purchase land and receive title thereto under the name of John Doe, and convey it under that name, without violating the law. This as a general proposition is true so long as the taking of a fictitious name is for an honest purpose and not tainted with fraud. The assistant district attorney felt that the very strength of his case created, as it were, a sort of legal weakness, for the more evidence he should put in against Brown, the clearer it would become that Hubert was merely Brown himself, and this would necessitate additional proof that Brown had taken the property in the name of Hubert for purposes of fraud, which could only be established by going into the whole history of the property. Of course, if Brown were so foolish as to put in the defense that Hubert really existed, the case would be plain sailing. If, however, Brown was as astute as the district attorney believed him to be, he might boldly admit that there was no Hubert except himself, and that in taking title to the property and disposing thereof under that name, he was committing no violation of law for which he could be prosecuted. The case was moved for trial on the 12th of March, 1906, before Judge Warren W. Foster, in Part 3 of the Court of General Sessions in New York. The defendant was arraigned at the bar without counsel, owing to the absence of his lawyer through sickness, and Mr. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, the later Lieutenant Governor of the state, was assigned to defend him. At this juncture, Brown arose and addressed the court. In the most deferential and conciliatory manner he urged that he was entitled to an adjournment until such time as he could produce William R. Hubert as a witness, stating that, although the latter had been in town on December 14th, and had personally given him the deeds in question, which he had handed to Leviton, Hubert's interests in the West had immediately called him from the city, and that he was then in Goldfields, Nevada, that since he had been in the Tombs he, Brown, had been in correspondence with a gentleman by the name of Alfred Skeels, of the Teller House, Central City, Colorado, from whom he had received a letter within the week to the effect that Hubert had arranged to start immediately for New York, for the purpose of testifying as a witness for the defense. The prosecutor thereupon demanded the production of this letter from the alleged Skeels, and Brown was compelled to state that he had immediately destroyed it on its receipt. The prosecutor then argued that under those circumstances, and in view of the fact that the people's evidence showed conclusively that no such person as Hubert existed, there was no reason why the trial should not proceed then and there. The court thereupon ruled that the case should go on. A jury was procured after some difficulty, and the evidence of Mr. Leviton received, showing that Brown had represented Hubert to be a man of substance, and had produced an affidavit, purported to be sworn to by Hubert, to the same effect, with deeds alleged to have been signed by him. Mrs. Bramman then swore that upon the same day Brown had himself acknowledged these very deeds and had sworn to the affidavit before her as a notary, under the name of William R. Hubert. Taken with the fact that Brown had in open court stated that Hubert was a living man, this made out a prima facie case. But, of course, the district attorney was unable to determine whether or not Brown would take the stand in his own behalf, or what his defense would be, and, in order to make assurance doubly sure, offered in evidence all the deeds to the property in question, thereby establishing the fact that it was originally part of the Peterson estate, and disclosing the means whereby it had eventually been recorded in the name of Hubert. The prosecution then rested its case, and the burden shifted to the defense to explain how all these deeds, attested by Brown, came to be executed and recorded. It was indeed a difficult, if not impossible, task which the accused lawyer undertook when he went upon the stand. He again positively and vehemently denied that he had signed the name of Hubert to the deed which he had offered to Leviton, and persisted in the contention that Hubert was a real man, who sooner or later would turn up. He admitted knowing the Peterson family in a casual way, and said he had done some business for them, but stated that he had not heard of their tragic death until some years after the sinking of the Gazer. He had then ascertained that no one had appeared to lay claim to Mrs. Peterson's estate, and he had accordingly taken it upon himself to adver it set for heirs. In due course Charles A. Clark had appeared and had deeded the property to Keeley, who in turn had conveyed it to O'Rourke. Just who this mysterious O'Rourke was he could not explain, nor could he account in any satisfactory manner for the recording in 1899 of the deed signed with Mary Peterson's mark. He said that it had turned up in O'Rourke's hands after O'Rourke had become possessed of the property through the action of the heirs, and that he had no recollection of ever having seen it before or having witnessed it. In the latter transactions, by which the property had been split up, he claimed to have acted only as attorney for the different grantors. He was unable to give the address or business of O'Rourke, Clark, Keeley or Freeman, and admitted that he had never seen any of them save at his own office. He was equally vague as to Hubert, whose New York residence he gave as 111 Fifth Avenue. No such person, however, had ever been known at that address. With the exception of the upper left-hand signature and the four immediately below it of H. Huffman Brown, these are all the signatures of imaginary persons invented by Brown to further his schemes. The upper right-hand slip shows the signatures to the Wilson bond, among which appears that of W.R. Hubert. With the exception of the upper left-hand signature and the four immediately below it of H. Huffman Brown, these are all the signatures of imaginary persons invented by Brown to further his schemes. The upper right-hand slip shows the signatures to the Wilson bond, among which appears that of W.R. Hubert. Brown gave his testimony in the same dry, polite and careful manner in which he had always been accustomed to discuss his cases and deliver his arguments. It Seemed wholly impossible to believe that this respectable-looking person could be a dangerous character, yet the nature of his offense and the consequences of it were apparent when the state called to the stand an old broom maker, who had bought from Brown one of the lots belonging to the Peterson estate. Holding up 3 stumps where fingers should have been, he cried out, choking with tears, "My friends, for 15 years I forked at making brooms me and my biff. From 5 in the morning until 6 at night, and I lose mine finger'n trying to save enough money to put a house that we could call our own. Then when we saved $800 this man come to us and he sold us a lot. We were very happy. Yesterday another man served me a paper that we must leave our house, because we did not own the land. We must go away. Where? We have no place to go. Our home is being taken from us, and that man pointing his stumps at Brown, that man has stolen it from us." He stopped, unable to speak. The defendant's lawyer properly objected, but, with this piece of testimony ringing in their ears, it is hardly surprising that the jury took but 5 minutes to convict Brown of forgery in the first degree. A few days later the judge sentenced him to 20 years in state's prison. Then other people began to wake up. The Attorney General guessed that the Peterson property had all sheeted to the state. The Swedish government sent a deputy to make inquiries. The Norwegian government was sure that he was a Norwegian, and the Danish that he was a Dane. No one knows yet who is the real owner, and there are half a dozen heirs squatting on every corner of it. Things are much worse than before Brown tried to sell the ill-fated lot to Leviton, but a great many people who were careless before are careful now. It soon developed, however, that lawyer Brown's industry and ingenuity had not been confined to the exploitation of the estate of Ebbe Peterson. Before the trial was well underway, the city chamberlain of New York notified the district attorney that a peculiar incident had occurred at his office, in which not only the defendant figured, but William R. Hubert, his familiar, as well. In the year 1904, a judgment had been entered in the Supreme Court, which adjudged that a certain George Wilson was entitled to a 1/6 interest in the estate of Jane Elizabeth Barker, recently deceased. George Wilson had last been heard of 20 years before, as a farmhand in Illinois, and his whereabouts were at this time unknown. Suddenly, however, he had appeared. That is to say, H. Huffman Brown had appeared as his attorney, and demanded his share of the property, which had been deposited to his credit with the city chamberlain and amounted to $7,500. The lawyer had presented a petition signed apparently by Wilson and a bond also subscribed by him, to which had been appended the names of certain sureties. One of these was a William R. Hubert. The same William R. Hubert who had mysteriously disappeared when his presence was so vital to the happiness and liberty of his creator. But the city chamberlain had not been on his guard, and had paid over the $7,500 to Brown without ever having seen the claimant or suspecting for an instant that all was not right. It was further discovered at the same time that Brown had made several other attempts to secure legacies remaining uncalled for in the city's treasury. In how many cases he had been successful will probably never be known, but it is unlikely that his criminal career dated only from the filing of the forged Peterson deed in 1896. Brown made an heroic and picturesque fight to secure a reversal of his conviction through all the state courts, and his briefs and arguments are monuments to his ingenuity and knowledge of the law. He alleged that his conviction was entirely due to a misguided enthusiasm on the part of the prosecutor, the present writer, whom he characterized as a novelist and dreamer. The whole case, he alleged, was constructed out of the latter's fanciful imagination, a cobweb of suspicion, accusation, and falsehood. Some day his friend Hubert would come out of the West, into which he had so unfortunately disappeared, and release an innocent man, sentenced, practically to death. Because the case had fallen into the hands of one whose sense of the dramatic was greater than his logic. Perchance he will. Mayhap, when H. Huffman Brown is the oldest inmate of Sing Sing, or even sooner, some gray-haired figure will appear at the state capitol, and knock tremblingly at the door of the executive, asking for a pardon, or a rehearing of the case, and claiming to be the only original, genuine William R. Hubert. Such a denouement would not be beyond the realms of possibility. But more likely the request will come in the form of a petition, duly attested and authenticated before some notary in the West, protesting against Brown's conviction and incarceration, and bearing the flowing signature of William R. Hubert, the same signature that appears on Brown's deeds to Levitt, and the same that is affixed to the bond of George Wilson, the vanished farmhand, claimant to the estate of Jane Elizabeth Barker. Story 8. A Murder Conspiracy. 4. William M. Rice, 84 years of age, died at the Berkshire Apartments at 500 Madison Avenue, New York City, at about half after 7 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, September 23, 1900. He had been ill for some time, but it was expected that he would recover. On or about the moment of his death, 2 elderly ladies, friends of the old gentleman, had called at the house with cakes and wine, to see him. The elevator man rang the bell of Mr. Rice's apartment again and again, but could elicit no response, and the ladies, much disappointed, went away. While the bell was ringing, Charles F. Jones, the confidential valet of the aged man, was waiting, he says, in an adjoining room until a cone saturated with chloroform, which he had placed over the face of his sleeping master, should effect his death. Did Jones murder Rice? If so, was it, as he claims, at the instigation of Albert T. Patrick? These two questions, now settled in the affirmative forever, so far as criminal and civil litigation are concerned, have been the subject of private study and public argument for more than 7 years. Mr. Rice was a childless widower, living the life of a recluse, attended only by Jones, who was at once his secretary, valet, and general servant. No other person lived in the apartment, and few visitors ever called there. Patrick was a New York lawyer with little practice who had never met Mr. Rice, was employed as counsel in litigation hostile to him, yet in whose favor a will purporting to be signed by Rice, June 30, 1900, turned up after the latter's death, by the terms of which Patrick came into the property, amounting to over $7 million, in place of a charitable institution named in an earlier will of 1896. It is now universally admitted that the alleged will of 1900 was a forgery, as well as 4 checks drawn to Patrick's order, 2 for $25,000 each, 1 for $65,000, and 1 for $135,000, which represented practically all of Rice's bank accounts, an order giving him control of the contents of Rice's safe deposit vaults, in which were more than $2,500,000 in securities, and also a general assignment by which he became the owner of Rice's entire estate. Thus, upon Rice's death, Patrick had every possible variety of document necessary to possess himself of the property. Jones took nothing under any of these fraudulent instruments. Hence Patrick's motive in desiring the death of Rice is the foundation stone of the case against him. But that Patrick desired and would profit by Rice's death in no way tends to establish that Rice did not die a natural death. Patrick would profit equally whether Rice died by foul means or natural, and the question as to whether murder was done must be determined from other evidence. This is only to be found in the confession of the valet Jones and in the testimony of the medical experts who performed the autopsy. Jones, a self-confessed murderer, swears that upon the advice and under the direction of Patrick, though in the latter's absence, he killed his master by administering chloroform. There is no direct corroborative evidence save that of the experts. Upon Jones's testimony depended the question of Patrick's conviction or acquittal, and of itself this was not sufficient, for being that of an accomplice it must, under the New York law, be corroborated. In the confession of Jones the state had sufficient direct evidence of the crime, and of Patrick's connection with it, providing there was other evidence tending to connect Patrick with its commission. This corroborative evidence is largely supplied by the facts which show that for a long time Patrick conspired with Jones to steal the bulk of Mr. Rice's estate at his death. This evidence not only shows Patrick's possible motive for planning Mr. Rice's murder, but also tends to corroborate Jones's whole story of the conspiracy. Rice did not know Patrick even by sight. He had heard of him only as a person retained by another lawyer, Holt, to do the dirty work in an action brought by Rice against Holt, as executor, to set aside Mrs. Rice's will, in which she assumed, under the community law of Texas, where Rice had formerly resided, to dispose of some $2,500,000 of Rice's property. If Rice was a resident of Texas, she had the legal right to do this, otherwise not. Holt employed Patrick to get evidence that Rice still was such a resident. Rice knew of this and hated Patrick. Patrick's connection with the Rice litigation had begun 4 years before the murder, which was not planned until August 1900. His first visit to Rice's apartment was made under the assumed name of Smith for the purpose of discovering whether the valet could be corrupted into furnishing fictitious proof of Rice's intent to reside in Texas. He flattered Jones, told him he was underpaid and not appreciated, and, after a second visit, at which he disclosed his right name, persuaded him to typewrite a letter on Rice's stationery addressed to Baker, Botts, Baker and Lovett, Rice's attorneys, in which he should be made to say that he had lost hope of winning the suit against Holt, was really a citizen of Texas, and wanted to settle the litigation. Patrick said that he could arrange for the signing of such a letter and was willing to pay Jones $250 for his help. Jones agreed. Patrick now learned that Mr. Rice was living with no companion except Jones, that he held little communication with the outside world, that the valet was in his confidence and thoroughly familiar with his papers, and that the will made in 1896 disinherited natural heirs in favor of an educational institution which he had founded in Texas. He also learned that while Mr. Rice was 84 years of age, he was in possession of all his faculties, conducted his own business, and might live for years. Possessed of these facts, Patrick's evil mind soon developed a conspiracy with Jones to secure the whole estate. Mr. Rice's pet charity was the William M. Rice Institute for the Advance of Science, Art, and Literature, of Texas, which he had founded in 1891. He had donated to it more than $1.5 million. By the will of 1896 only. Small legacies were bequeathed to relatives, while the bulk of his fortune was left to the Institute. About a month after Patrick's first visit to the Berkshire Apartments, that is, in December 1899, while he and Jones were examining Rice's private papers, they stumbled upon the will. Patrick saw his opportunity. By the forgery of a new will, which would increase the legacies of those mentioned in the will of 1896 and leave legacies to every person who might have any claim upon the estate. It would be for the interest of those persons to sustain and carry into effect the forgery. The whole scheme was based upon the belief that every man has his price. He told Jones that he thought the will unjust, that he did not think it right to leave so little to relatives, and later he brought to Jones a rough draft of a will, which could be substituted for the genuine one. Patrick was to get half the estate. The relatives were to receive double or 3 times the amount provided in the 1896 will, and what was left was to be given to the Rice Institute. He proposed that Jones should typewrite this will, and guaranteed to arrange for the witnessing and signing of it, and promised that Jones should get whatever he wanted. Jones at first objected, but was finally won over. Rewritten many times to include new ideas of the conspirators, the document finally reached the form of the will of June 30, 1900, in which Patrick substituted himself for the Rice Institute and made himself one of the executors. An ingenious part of the conspiracy was the decision to leave the 1896 will in existence. If Patrick had destroyed it and the relatives had succeeded in overthrowing the will of 1900, the estate would have been left without testamentary disposition and the relatives would have got more than was provided by either will. With the will of 1896 in existence, however, the relatives would get less if they overthrew the forgery. By retaining it, therefore, Patrick figured that the relatives would have selfish reasons for accepting the forgery as genuine. The preparation of this bogus will occupied about a month, and the next question was the procurement of witnesses. It was desirable to get the same persons who witnessed the former will. These were Walter H. Weatherby and W. F. Harmon, clerks for many years at Swenson's banking house. On the assumption that Weatherby had been injured by Rice and was therefore hostile to him, Jones practically unfolded the scheme. He told Weatherby that one of Mr. Rice's bonds had disappeared and that Rice had accused Weatherby of stealing it. He wound up with the suggestion, "I will get one witness and you can get another, and the thing is done." But Weatherby indignantly declined to join in the conspiracy. Morris Myers, who had been employed in Patrick's office, and David L. Short, a friend of both, were the false witnesses finally selected. They were clothed with the appearance of honesty and were brought into contact with Rice by Jones at various times, Myers as a notary public, and Short as Commissioner of Deeds for the state of Texas, an appointment procured for him by Patrick probably for this specific purpose. The date of the forged will, June 30, 1900, was selected to correspond with the date of 3 genuine papers which Rice acknowledged before Short on that date. Last page of the forged will of 1900, showing the forgery of Rice's signature and the false attestation of Short and Myers. Last page of the forged will of 1900, showing the forgery of Rice's signature and the false attestation of Short and Myers. The next step was to obviate the absurdity of Patrick's being selected as the residuary legatee at a time when he was engaged in bitter litigation against Rice. The best way out was for Patrick to pose as a lawyer who had brought about a settlement of this expensive litigation and thus won Rice's regard. Patrick first tried to accomplish this by getting friends to visit Rice and urge a settlement. But Rice rebuffed them all. Accordingly, Patrick again resorted to forgery, and in August, 1900, manufactured an instrument of settlement, dated March 6, 1900. But such an agreement would not explain the paradox of a man whom Rice hated and despised and did not know by sight turning up as the principal beneficiary under his will. It was necessary to manufacture evidence to be used. After Rice's death in support of his claim of close relations, the idea of a personal meeting with Rice had been abandoned on Jones's advice, and Patrick therefore caused the valet to prepare 25 or 30 forged letters addressed to him and purporting to come from Rice. These referred to current business matters and conveyed the impression that it was Rice's custom to seek the lawyer's advice. One instructed Patrick as to the terms of the will of 1900. Carbon copies were made for filing in Rice's letter book after his death, to make assurance doubly sure and to secure immediate possession of Rice's securities. A general assignment to Patrick of all Rice's estate was forged, and an order giving him access to and possession of the securities on deposit in Rice's safety vault. But Patrick did not stop here. He procured from Jones 3 checks signed by Mr. Rice in the regular course of business, one payable to Jones for his July salary and the other two for the July and August salary of an employee of Rice's in Texas named Cohn. These 3 checks Patrick kept as models, forwarding to Cohn 2 forged checks filled out by Jones upon which Rice's signature had been traced, and returning to Jones a substitute check with Rice's signature traced upon it. All 3 checks passed through the bank's unsuspected traced signatures were also substituted for genuine ones upon letters dictated by Rice to his Texas correspondents. Thus Patrick secured the circulation of 5 copies of Rice's signature which, if occasion demanded, he could produce as standards of comparison to correspond with his other forgeries. The principal preparations were complete, but title under the will might long be delayed and perhaps even eventually fail. Patrick was poor and in no condition to conduct adequately a serious litigation. The moment Mr. Rice died, a large amount of cash would be necessary. For the procurement of this, Patrick and Jones looked to the current balance of Rice's bank account, which amounted to some $250,000 on deposit at Swenson's private bank and at the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. With this they felt reasonably secure of success. For even if the will should be set aside as fraudulent, they had a second line of defense in the general assignment of the estate and the orders to Rice's $2,500,000 of securities. While the evidence affords a motive for Patrick to desire the death of Mr. Rice, it does not of itself, up to this point, indicate the slightest intention on the part of Patrick to do away with the old gentleman. It was therefore conceded by the prosecution that, upon Jones's own testimony, the conspiracy to murder was not formed until about 7 weeks before the event. The first evidence which points to an intent to murder is the famous cremation letter, dated August 3d. The cremation letter from Mr. Rice, authorizing Patrick to cremate his body, shows that Patrick intended to do away with Rice in such a way that an autopsy must, if possible, be prevented and the evidence of murder destroyed. That Patrick forged such a letter was evidence that his connection with the murder was premeditated and deliberate. To cremate the body before an autopsy, it was necessary to procure a physician's certificate that Rice had died from natural causes. He therefore made preparation to secure such a certificate, and then upon the strength of the cremation letter to give directions for the immediate destruction of the body. Patrick, with the view of having at hand a physician who would be unsuspicious, and who would issue a certificate of death from natural causes, induced Jones to send for Dr. Curry, his own friend and physician, on an occasion when the valet was ill. This was in March, 1900. Dr. Curry came, and Jones, acting under Patrick's advice, cautioned him not to mention the lawyer's name to Rice. In course of time he saw Rice, gained his good opinion and became his attending physician. But Rice did not die, and curiously enough it was he himself who suggested to Jones the instrumentality of death which was finally employed, for he read an article dealing with the dangers of chloroform as an anesthetic, and discussed it with the valet. This suggestion was conveyed to Patrick, who asked Dr. Curry whether chloroform left any traces discoverable upon an autopsy. Dr. Curry rather carelessly replied that it left but slight traces if administered only in the quantities which would be fatal to a man with a weak heart. Patrick told Jones, so Jones alleges, to procure some chloroform, and this he did, sending to Texas for 2 bottles of 2 ounces each. From Dr. Curry's remarks it was manifest that a weakened condition of the patient was an important element, and as Jones was taking some mercury pills, prescribed for him by Dr. Curry, the valet induced his master to take some of them. The old gentleman was benefited, however, rather than weakened. This was before the forgery of the cremation letter. It was clear that larger doses of mercury would be necessary, and accordingly Patrick furnished Jones with pellets containing the drug in such quantities that Jones, experimenting with one of them, became ill. They had now the means to effect gradual death, but as mercury leaves traces discernible at an autopsy, it was decided that the body must be cremated promptly. Hence the cremation letter. It was hoped that Rice might drop off at any moment, owing to his weakened condition, and in anticipation of death. Patrick discontinued his visits to the apartment in order to establish a satisfactory alibi. Jones also frequently absented himself from the apartment in the evenings. After the old man had fallen asleep, the famous letter forged by Patrick, which requests the cremation of the remains of the supposed writer, old Mr. Rice. Last page of the forged will of 1900. Showing the forgery of Rice's signature, and the false attestation of Short and Myers. On September 16 Rice had an attack of acute indigestion, which might have resulted seriously had it not been for the mercurial pills which promptly relieved him. The reader should observe that practically all of this testimony comes from Jones. There is no extraneous evidence that Patrick induced the giving of the mercury. Patrick, however, spread false rumors as to Rice's general health and also as to his financial condition and intentions, namely, that Rice was only worth $750,000, and that those who expected he was going to leave his money to the Institute were doomed to disappointment. But neither his statements about Rice's condition nor his remarks as to the disposition and extent of his property are inconsistent with a mere hope that he would die and thus leave Patrick free to enjoy the fruits of his forgeries. There now occurred, however, an event which may well have played a part in inducing Patrick to supplement forgery by murder. On Sunday, September 16, the plant of the Merchants and Planters Oil Company of Houston, Texas, of which Rice owned 75% of the capital stock, was destroyed by fire. The company being without funds to rebuild, its directors telegraphed to Rice requesting him to advance the money. The amount needed was $250,000, and if Rice consented, all the available funds on deposit in the New York banks, upon which the conspirators relied to accomplish their object, would be exhausted. Jones endeavored to dissuade the old man from advancing the money, but without effect, and Rice sent a letter to Houston, agreeing to supply $150,000 and more in installments of $25,000 each. This was on September 18. After he had wired to the same effect on September 17. Patrick and Jones suppressed a telegram that Rice would advance $250,000, and on September 19 the old man received word that the first draft in Conformity with his telegram of September 17 had been drawn and would arrive in New York on the 22d. Jones says that on showing this to Patrick, the latter announced that Rice must be put out of the way as soon as possible. Accordingly, on September 20th and 21st, Jones administered larger doses of mercury than usual, which, while weakening and depressing him, failed to cause his end. Saturday, September 22d, the draft was presented at Rice's apartment. The old man was not confined to his bed, but Jones told the bank messenger, after pretending to consult him, that Rice was too ill to attend to business that day and to return on Monday. That night Jones and Patrick met, and it was agreed, according to Jones, that Rice must not be allowed to survive until Monday. They still hoped that he might die without any further act upon their part, but Jones was informed by Dr. Curry that, although the old man seemed weak and under a great mental strain, he nevertheless thought that he would recover. This Curry also told to Patrick, the latter calling at the doctor's house about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. "You think Mr. Rice will be able to go down Monday morning?" Patrick asked. "You had better wait until Monday morning comes," replied Dr. Curry. "Do you think he will be able to go downtown next week?" persisted the lawyer. The doctor answered in the affirmative. That night Mr. Rice slept quietly until 8 o'clock Sunday morning. Dr. Curry called and found him in excellent condition, having eaten a hearty breakfast. His heart was a trifle weak, but it was sound. His organs were all working normally. He felt no pain. The doctor left without prescribing any medicine, stating that he would not return unless called, and expressing his opinion that the patient would recover. This was about 11 o'clock, and Jones immediately hastened to Patrick's house and reported the conversation. It was clear that Rice's death would not occur before Monday morning. He might live to pay over the $250,000, long enough to give further testimony in the Holt litigation, and thus expose the whole fraudulent scheme of pretended settlement and of friendly relations with the lawyer, and finally, perhaps, even to make a new will. The success of the conspiracy demanded that Rice should die that night. Did he die naturally? Was his death caused by any further act of the conspirators? Did Jones kill him by means of chloroform? Jones's story is that Patrick supplied him with some oxalic acid which was to be mixed with powdered ammonia and diluted in water, on the theory that it was preferable to chloroform since it would not require Jones's presence in the room. At the moment of death, Jones said that he endeavored to administer the mixture to the old man, but that he refused to take it. Jones had already procured the chloroform from Texas, as has been stated, and had turned it over to Patrick. He says that afternoon he procured this from Patrick, who told him how to administer it. This was a few moments after 6 o'clock. Rice was sleeping soundly. The colored woman who did the housework was absent for the day and the rooms were deserted. He saturated a sponge with chloroform, constructed a cone out of a towel, placed the sponge in the cone, put the cone over the sleeping man's face and ran out of the room and waited 30 minutes for the chloroform to complete the work. Waiting in the next room he heard the doorbell ring, and ring again, but he paid no attention to the summons. In point of fact he was never quite sure himself whether the bell was not the creation of his own overwrought brain. At the end of half an hour he returned to the bedroom, removed the cone from Rice's face and saw that he was dead. Then after burning the sponge and the towel in the kitchen range he opened the windows, straightened the rooms out, called the elevator man, asked him to send for Dr. Curry, and telephoned to Patrick that Rice was dead. Jones had no sooner telephoned Patrick that Rice was dead than the lawyer hastened to Dr. Curry's, and within 40 minutes appeared with him in Rice's apartments, assuming complete charge. Summoning an undertaker and having the cremation letter at hand, he gave orders for speedy cremation. But he now discovered the principal mistake in his calculations. He had omitted to investigate the length of time required to heat the crematory. This he now discovered to his horror to be 24 hours. But the body must be destroyed. The undertaker suggested that the body might be embalmed while the crematory was being heated, and Patrick at once seized upon the suggestion and gave orders to that effect, although the cremation letter sets forth specifically that one of the reasons why Rice desired cremation was his horror of being embalmed. The body was embalmed at the apartments that night, Dr. Curry innocently supplying the certificate of death from old age and weak heart, and as immediate cause, indigestion followed by colorectal diarrhea with mental worry. Having arranged for the cremation at the earliest possible moment, Jones and Patrick rifled the trunk in which Rice kept his papers, and stuffed them in a satchel which Patrick bore away with him. The funeral was to be held early Tuesday morning and the ashes conveyed by Jones to Milwaukee, to be interred near the body of Rice's wife, while the relatives should not be notified until it should be too late for them to reach New York. The next step was to secure the $250,000 which Rice had on deposit. Patrick had already forged Rice's name to blank checks on Swenson and the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. Early Monday morning Jones, with Patrick looking over his shoulder and directing him, filled out the body of the checks, which covered all but $10,000 of Rice's deposits. These consisted of one for $25,000 and one for $65,000 on Swenson, one for $25,000 and another for $135,000 on the trust company. They were all made payable to the order of Patrick and dated September 22d, the day before Rice's death. One of the drafts on the Fifth Avenue Trust Company was cashed for him by a friend named Potts early Monday morning, and was paid without suspicion. But now came the second error, which resulted in the exposure of the conspiracy and conviction for murder. Jones, in filling out the $25,000 check on Swenson, had in his nervousness omitted the L from Patrick's Christian name, so that the check read Aber T. Patrick, and Patrick in his excitement had failed to notice the omission or attempt to obviate it by extra endorsement. This $25,000 Swenson check was intrusted to David L. Short for presentation to Swenson and Sons for certification. When he presented it, Wallace, the clerk, recognized Jones's handwriting in the body of it, and thought the signature looked unnatural. He took it to a rear office, where he showed it to Weatherby, who was the person whom Jones had approached 9 months before with the request that he join the conspiracy to manufacture a bogus will. Weatherby compared the signature on the check with genuine signatures in the bank, and returned it to Short without any intimation that he regarded it as irregular, but assigning as the reason the defect in the endorsement. Short thereupon returned the check to Patrick, who supplied the necessary supplementary endorsement and telephoned to Jones what had occurred, instructing him to say that the check was all right in case the Swensons should inquire. Half an hour later Short returned to Swenson's, where the check was examined by one of the firm. Rice's apartments were then called up, and Jones said that the checks were all right. But this did not satisfy Mr. Swenson, so he instructed Wallace to call up the apartment again and insist on talking to Mr. Rice. Jones delayed replying to Wallace and in the afternoon called up Patrick on the telephone, inquiring what he should say. Patrick replied that he would have to say that Rice was dead. And in accordance with this, Jones informed Swenson that Rice had died at 8 o'clock the previous evening. It was thus clear to Swenson that although the maker of the check was dead, Patrick, a lawyer, cognizant of that fact, was seeking to secure payment upon it. For Jones had told Swenson that he had reported Rice's death to the doctor and to Rice's lawyer. Patrick, accompanied by Potts, went immediately to the bank, where Swenson informed him that the check could be paid only to the administrator. Patrick replied that there would be no administrator, that Rice had left no property in this state, and informed Swenson that he had an assignment by Rice to himself of all Rice's securities with Swenson. He also invited Swenson to the funeral. Later in the day, Patrick attempted to obtain possession of Rice's securities in the Safety Deposit Company and in the Fifth Avenue Trust Company, by presenting forged instruments of transfer and the orders heretofore referred to, but after some delay the trust companies declined him access. The conspiracy had begun to go to pieces. The two mistakes and the failure to secure funds placed Patrick in a dangerous position. 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, 18 hours after the death, Jones, at Patrick's direction, began to notify the relatives that Rice had died the evening before, and that the funeral would take place the following morning. The telegrams to Baker and to Rice, Jr., in Texas, were in the following extraordinary form. Mr. Rice died 8 o'clock last night under care of physicians. Death certificate. Old age, weak heart, delirium. Left instructions to be interred in Milwaukee with wife. Funeral 10 a.m. tomorrow at 500 Madison Avenue. It is significant that care was used to convey the information that the death was a natural one with a physician in attendance, that the body was to be interred in Milwaukee, without reference to the cremation. This may well have been so that, if any suspicions of foul play should arise, the recipients, realizing that they could not reach New York in time to arrest matters there, might hasten to Milwaukee to intercept the body, where they could be met by Jones with the cremation letter in his pocket and his urn of ashes under his arm. But the telegram did arouse suspicion, and Baker and Rice immediately wired Jones as follows: "Please make no disposition of Rice's remains until we arrive. We leave tonight. Arrive New York Thursday morning." Baker also instructed N.A. Meldrum, a Texan then in New York, to cooperate with Jones in preserving everything intact. In the meantime, however, Swenson had notified his attorneys, who in turn had informed the police and the district attorney's office, and that evening at about 11 o'clock James W. Gerard, accompanied by a detective, who posed as the lawyer's clerk, interviewed Patrick at his home. Patrick informed Gerard that he had an assignment of all Rice's property and also a will of Rice's of which he was executor. This was the first reference to the will of 1900. He also informed Gerard that he would not receive a cent under its provision. To have explained the real terms of the will would, under the circumstances, have excited too much suspicion. Yet he was eager to let the Swensons know that as executor he was in a position to control the profitable banking business that would arise from the settlement of the estate. In the meantime, 4 headquarters detectives, representing themselves as lawyers, visited the apartments. Patrick hurried to 500 Madison Avenue, where he learned of Meldrum's presence in town. Things were turning out far from the way in which he had expected. He then hastened to his office downtown, which he reached about 1:30 in the morning, and, alone, destroyed great quantities of paper, attempting to dispose of them through the toilet bowl, which was so clogged that the water flowed out upon the floor, necessitating an apology to the janitor. In the silence of the night, misgivings came upon him. He lost his nerve, and at 2 o'clock in the morning called up the undertaker and revoked the signed order for cremation, which he had given. Leaving the office at about 5 in the morning, he first visited Myers, thence proceeded to his own boarding house, and from there went to the apartments, which he reached at 8 o'clock. Here he found the detectives who had been on guard since early morning to forestall any attempt to remove the body. At the funeral itself he attempted to conciliate adverse interests and to win witnesses for his purpose. He had begun to do this the very night that Rice had died, when he told the elevator man that he was remembered in Rice's will. He had also informed Weatherby that he had a $5,000 legacy. At the funeral were Blinn, one of Rice's nephews, who had come on from Massachusetts, and 2 ladies, to each of whom he stated that they had legacies, which would soon be available provided there was no contest of the will. 4 forged signatures of W. M. Rice, which bisected and rearranged haphazard, fit exactly, thus showing that they were made from the same model. This would be an utter impossibility in the case of 4 genuine signatures. 4 forged signatures of W. M. Rice, which bisected and rearranged haphazard, fit exactly, thus showing that they were made from the same model. This would be an utter impossibility in the case of 4 genuine signatures. Forged assignment of vault at the New York Safe Deposit Co. from Rice to Patrick. Forged assignment of vault at the New York Safe Deposit Co. from Rice to Patrick. The detectives now informed Patrick that he was wanted at headquarters, and Patrick invited Potts to accompany him, informing the latter that the police suspected that there was something unnatural in the cause of death, but that he could explain satisfactorily. As a matter of fact, no such intimation had been made to him by the police or anyone else. At police headquarters, after an interview with Inspector McCluskey, he was permitted to go his way. Patrick returned to Rice's apartments, sent for Short and Myers, and conferred with them there. He took this occasion to tell Maria Scott, the colored woman who worked in the apartment, that she was suspected of having poisoned Rice, and that she had better say nothing about his death. Jones told her that she was remembered in the will and that it would be worth her while to stand by himself and Patrick, who would see that she was taken care of. Meanwhile, the coroner had sent the body to the morgue for autopsy. The autopsy was performed on Tuesday, 43 hours after death occurred, by Dr. Donlin, a coroner's physician, in the presence of Dr. Williams, also a coroner's physician, and of Professor R. A. Whitthos, an expert chemist. The 2 physicians testified at the trial that the organs of the body, except the lungs, were normal in condition, save as affected by the embalming fluid. They and Professor Whitthos agreed in their testimony that the lungs were congested. Dr. Donlin spoke of their being congested all over, while Dr. Williams characterized it as an intense congestion of the lungs coextensive with them. Outside of the lungs they found no evidence of disease to account for death, and beyond the congestion these showed nothing except a small patch of consolidated tissue about the size of a 25-cent piece. They testified, in effect, that nothing save the inhalation of some gaseous irritant could have produced such a general congestion, and that the patch of tissue referred to was insufficient to account for the amount of congestion present. Dr. Donlin could not testify what the proximate cause of death was, but was firm in his opinion that no cause for it was observable in the other vital organs. In this Dr. Williams concurred. He was of the opinion that chloroform would act as an irritant upon the lungs and cause precisely that general congestion observable in the case of the deceased. Professor Witthos testified that his analysis revealed the presence of mercury, obtained as calomel, and while the amount was not sufficient to cause death, its presence indicated that a larger quantity had existed in life. The embalming fluid had contained no mercury, and he and Dr. Donlin agreed that the embalming fluid would have no effect upon the lungs beyond a tendency to bleach them. In other words, the people's evidence was to the effect that no cause of death was observable from a medical examination of the body save the congestion stated to exist in the lungs, and that this might have been caused by chloroform. Thursday morning Mr. Baker and F.A. Rice, the brother of the deceased, arrived in New York. Patrick showed them the cremation letter, and, inasmuch as they took a neutral position in the matter, ordered the cremation to proceed, and accordingly it took place that very day. He also endeavored to win the confidence of Baker, but succeeded in accomplishing little. He finally gave the latter a copy of the 1900 will and the original will of 1896. He also informed Baker that he had taken a large number of papers from Rice's apartments, and turned over to him a considerable number of them. He also surrendered on Friday the 2 Swenson checks. After considerable discussion Baker told Patrick flatly that he would never consent to the probate of the 1900 will, that he was satisfied that the 96 will was the last will of Rice, and that he would insist upon its being probated, to which Patrick replied, that so far as he was concerned he did not know but that the probate of the 96 will would suit him just as well as the probate of the 1900 will. That it was a matter of indifference to him, and that so far as the Rice Institute was concerned he was prepared to give Baker from $3 to $5 million for it, or any other sum Baker might name. These negotiations and conferences continued until the 4th of October, Patrick yielding step by step, until he had divested himself of all control of the documents and securities. Meantime, sufficient evidence having been secured, Patrick and Jones were arrested on a charge of forgery and held for the grand jury. Bail was fixed at $10,000 each, but was not forthcoming. On October 21, Mr. House, Patrick's lawyer, visited Patrick and Jones in the Tombs. Jones says that after Patrick had talked to Mr. House, the former called Jones to one corner of the room and told him that House insisted on knowing definitely whether a crime had been committed, and directed Jones to tell House that a murder had been committed, but that he, Patrick, was not concerned in it. This Jones declined to do without implicating Patrick. The two prisoners then returned to House, and Jones says that he informed House that he had killed Rice by chloroform, and gave him the same story which he told on the witness stand. After this Jones apparently lost his nerve and told Patrick that he intended to commit suicide. This idea Patrick encouraged, agreeing that they should both do it at about the same time. On the 26th of October Jones made a statement to Assistant District Attorney Osborne which was in large part false, and in which he endeavored to exonerate himself entirely from complicity in any of the crimes, and in which he charged the actual administration of the chloroform to Patrick. 4 days later Osborne sent for him and told him he had lied, upon which Jones became confused, continued to persist in some of his statements, qualified others, and withdrew still others. He was completely unnerved, and that night attempted, by means of a knife which Patrick had supplied him, to cut his throat. The attempt was a failure, and he was removed to Bellevue Hospital, where he remained until November 12. He then finally gave the statement which corresponded with his testimony upon the trial, and which jibed with all the circumstances and evidence. Known to the district attorney. Did Patrick conspire with Jones to murder Rice? What corroboration is there of Jones's story that he killed Rice under Patrick's direction? First, what proof is there that murder was committed? Roughly, that Jones so swore, that Rice died at the time alleged, that he did not die from disease, but that he died from a congestion of the lungs which could have occurred only in the case of a living organism by the administration of some such irritant as chloroform, that someone, therefore, must have killed him, and that Jones alone had the opportunity. Second, what proof is there that Patrick directed the murder? Evidence of an elaborate conspiracy, as briefly heretofore set forth, which contemplated the death of Rice. Of course Patrick wanted Rice to die. If Patrick was not implicated in the killing, what motive had Jones to commit the deed? Why did Rice die at the precise psychological moment which would enable Patrick to prevent $250,000 on deposit being diverted to Texas? And finally, why did Patrick prepare a forged cremation letter for the destruction of the body? If the conspiracy contemplated a natural death, nothing could be of greater value to the two parties concerned than the means of proving that the death was not unnatural. This, in the most abbreviated form, is the case against Patrick. Space forbids any reference to his elaborate and ingenious defense, which was based entirely on an alleged complete failure of corroboration of Jones's testimony. Starting with the premise that the word of a self-confessed murderer and thrice perjured scoundrel was valueless as proof, he contended that there was no adequate evidence that Rice's death was felonious, and that the congestion of the lungs could have been and was caused by the embalming fluid and was only attributed to the chloroform after Jones had given his final version of how the murder was accomplished. Technically the case against Patrick was not a strong one. Dramatically it was overwhelming. His own failure to testify and his refusal to allow his lawyer, Mr. House, to relate what passed between them in the tombs remain significant, although not evidence proper for a jury to consider. Wherever lawyers shall get together, there the Patrick case will be discussed with its strong points and its weak ones, its technicalities and its tactics, and the ethics of the liberation of Jones, the actual murderer, now long since vanished into the obscurity from which he came. On the one hand stands a public convinced of Patrick's guilt, and on the other the convicted lifer pointing a lean finger at the valet Jones and stubbornly repeating, "I am innocent." For in 1906 the governor of New York commuted the death sentence of Albert T. Patrick to life imprisonment, and the most extraordinary struggle in the legal history of the state on the part of a convicted murderer for his own life came to an end. The defendant in the death house at Sing Sing had invoked every expedient to escape punishment, and by the use of his knowledge had even saved a fellow prisoner, Mike Brush, from the electric chair.